Have you ever felt profoundly wronged by life? Have you ever lifted your eyes to the heavens in the midst of excruciating pain, your soul drowning in anguish, and whispered or screamed the question that echoes throughout human history, "Why, my God?" This question is not merely a sign of doubt. It is the cry of a heart seeking meaning in chaos, yearning for justice in a world that often seems indifferent and cruel. It's a question born on the border between faith and despair, a gateway to the deepest of spiritual mysteries. We invite you to walk with us along this very border, exploring the story of a man whose life became the stage for a divine answer, an answer that did not come in easy words, but in the fire of a trial that shook the foundations of heaven and earth, revealing the true nature of worship. To understand this cosmic drama, we must travel back in time and space to the ancient land of Uz, where a man named Job lived. He was no ordinary man. The very voice of God described him with a singular honor, as a servant who was blameless and upright, a man who feared God and shunned evil. Think about the depth of this testimony. It wasn't a friend, a relative, or a religious leader who praised him. It was the creator of the universe who vouched for his character. Job represented the pinnacle of human faithfulness, a living example of a life dedicated to righteousness and reverence. His story, therefore, does not begin with a sinner in need of correction, but with the most righteous of men about to face the most unjust of trials, establishing a paradox that challenges our understanding of God's sovereignty and goodness. Now, behold the image that has become the eternal symbol of his agony. See Job, no longer in his palaces, but sitting on a pile of ashes, a place of mourning and desolation. His body, once healthy and prosperous, is covered in painful sores from head to toe. He, who was the greatest man in the East, has lost everything: his livestock, his properties, his servants, and, in the most devastating of all tragedies, all his sons and daughters in a single day. The crown of his life has been turned to dust, his joy to lamentation. This scene of absolute despair is the starting point of our investigation. We are not just looking at a man who suffers, we are witnessing the epicenter of a spiritual earthquake whose shockwaves extend all the way to the throne room of God. Here, the central mystery is forged, a question that haunts us to this day. If God is perfectly just and good, why would he allow the most faithful of his servants to face the deepest and most overwhelming pain? The story of Job rips us from our theological certainties and forces us to confront what we call the problem of suffering. Why do bad things happen to good people? Job's life becomes a courtroom where the very justice of God seems to be on trial. The silence of the heavens in the face of his pain is deafening, and it is in this silence that the true conflict of the story begins to unfold, a conflict that goes far beyond the simple human understanding of cause and effect, of sin and punishment. Many of us, upon seeing such a calamity, would instinctively search for a reason, a hidden fault to justify the punishment. Job's friends certainly went down this path, convinced that such extreme suffering could only be the result of an equally extreme secret sin. However, the book of Job warns us against these simplistic conclusions. It invites us to suspend our judgment and consider a more complex and disconcerting possibility, that a believer's suffering may not be a sign of divine punishment, but part of an unseen and much greater purpose, a celestial drama that our earthly eyes cannot perceive. The story of Job compels us to look up beyond the human horizon in search of answers. The key to deciphering this enigma lies not in the land of Uz, but in a dimension that exists beyond our physical world, the heavenly throne room. Before the first tragedy even struck Job, a cosmic assembly was in session. The sons of God, angelic beings, presented themselves before the Lord, and among them was a sinister figure, a spiritual adversary. Job's personal tragedy, therefore, was not an accident of fate nor a random act of evil. It was the direct result of a dialogue, an accusation, and a permission granted in the very presence of God. The suffering he experienced on earth was merely the visible reflection of an invisible battle of eternal proportions. In this celestial court, an accusation was leveled not against Job specifically, but against the very nature of human faith. The accuser, known in Hebrew as Ha-Satan, presented a cynical and powerful argument. Do humans serve God only out of self-interest? Are worship and obedience merely an exchange for blessings, health, and prosperity? Satan essentially argued that if the divine hedge of protection were removed, Job's faith would be exposed as a sham, and he would curse God to his face. Job's integrity thus became the battlefield for a universal question. Is humanity's love for its creator genuine, or is it just a form of spiritual bribery? Prepare yourself, for we are about to delve into the depths of this epic drama. We will follow the tracks of Job's tears from his ash heap to the gates of eternity to hear the debate that will define the value of true faith. This is not just the story of a man who lost everything. It is a glimpse into the sovereignty of God, the tenacity of human faith, and the revelation that the purest worship is not born from abundance, but blossoms in the barren soil of suffering. Job's journey will teach us that sometimes we must lose everything we have to discover the only thing that truly matters. If you've ever gone through a trial you didn't understand, hit the like button to let us know we're on this journey together. While in the land of Uz, the dust of tragedy began to settle on the life of a righteous man, a drama of infinitely greater proportions was unfolding in a dimension invisible to our eyes. We, limited by our carnal perception, see only the effect, the wound, the loss. But the story of Job invites us to lift the veil that separates the temporal from the eternal to witness the cause, the heavenly conversation that preceded the catastrophe. To understand the depth of Job's pain, we must first comprehend the grand scale of the stage on which his faith was tested. It was not a merely human drama. It was a cosmic conflict where the fate of one soul became the center of a question that would echo throughout eternity, defining the very nature of the relationship between the Creator and his creatures. Let us now transport our imagination beyond the stars to the throne room of the Most High. This is not a place that can be described with the language of human architecture, with walls of gold or floors of crystal. It is a reality woven from the very essence of its ruler, unapproachable light, power that sustains galaxies, and a holiness so pure that it causes the seraphim to cover their faces. It is the nerve center of the universe, the point from which all decrees emanate, the source of all life and all authority. In this place, the sound of silence is more eloquent than any symphony, and the presence of the king is the very definition of reality. Everything that exists finds its purpose and meaning before this throne of unfathomable majesty and glory. In this setting of absolute reverence, a solemn assembly gathers. The Bible calls them the sons of God, angelic beings, celestial princes and governors of the cosmic provinces who come from their posts throughout the universe to present themselves before the sovereign king. Imagine the scene, creatures of unimaginable power and splendor bowing in silent adoration, not out of obligation, but from an overwhelming recognition of the infinite superiority of the one who created them. Each of them is a force of nature capable of altering the course of nations, but there, in the presence of the Eternal One, they are like humble servants awaiting the word of their master. The atmosphere is charged with a holiness that purifies and a power that commands the cosmos with a single thought. At the center of it all is the throne. We cannot describe the one who sits upon it, for no human image or word could contain his glory. His presence is felt like a consuming fire, and at the same time like a peace that surpasses all understanding. It is from this focal point of absolute authority that the conversation about Job begins. Divine omniscience needs no reports, but the heavenly court operates with an order and protocol that reveal the justice and wisdom of the king. It is he who introduces Job's name into the celestial agenda, not as a defendant, but as his exemplary servant, the gold standard of faithfulness on earth. The Creator takes pride in his creation, presenting Job as living proof of the goodness and righteousness that he himself planted in the human heart. However, amidst this assembly of loyal and radiant beings, one figure stands out for his dissonant perspective. He is not a rebel with horns and a tail, as popular iconography has portrayed him. He is Ha-Satan, a Hebrew word meaning the accuser or the adversary. His function at that moment is that of a celestial prosecutor, a skeptical inspector who roams the earth searching for flaws, hypocrisies, and impure motives. He does not challenge God's power, but he questions the integrity of his creation. His presence in the court is not an invasion, but part of a permitted order, where even opposition and doubt serve a greater purpose within divine sovereignty, forcing the truth to come to light under the most intense pressure. It is crucial that we understand the narrative role of this entity. The accuser operates on a fundamentally cynical premise. No one serves God for nothing. He believes that all piety, all worship, and all obedience are ultimately driven by selfishness. To him, faith is not an act of love, but a contract for benefits. Humans, in his view, are transactional creatures who only offer loyalty as long as they receive protection and prosperity. He looks at creation and sees not devoted children, but spiritual mercenaries. His mission, as he sees it, is to unmask this supposed universal hypocrisy and prove that the relationship between God and humanity is a well-intentioned but ultimately empty charade. It is in this context that God, with his infinite wisdom, turns the spotlight on his servant. "Have you considered my servant Job?" the Lord asks. This is not a question for lack of information, it is a deliberate challenge. God is effectively placing Job at the center of the cosmic stage, presenting him as the living refutation of the accuser's cynical philosophy. Job's life, blessed and prosperous, was a visible testimony to the reward of faithfulness. But God knew the heart of his servant on a level that went far beyond external circumstances. He knew that Job's faith was not an adornment for times of peace, but an anchor forged to withstand the most violent of storms. The accuser's response is the precise articulation of his universal distrust. Does Job fear God for nothing? This question is the axis around which the entire narrative revolves. Satan argues that God has built a hedge of protection around Job, his family, and his possessions. He suggests that Job's faith has never been truly tested, as it has always been associated with a life of comfort and blessings. The accusation is subtle but devastating. Job's righteousness is not genuine. It is a product of his favorable environment. "Remove the blessings," says the accuser, "and Job's true self-serving nature will be revealed. He will not just curse his life, but he will curse God to his very face." This is not just a wager on one man's faith, it is a profound questioning of God's own justice and wisdom. Satan is, in effect, accusing God of being a ruler who buys the loyalty of his subjects with gifts. If the accusation is true, then God's moral universe is a fraud, and worship is nothing more than an exchange of favors. The question at stake is monumental. Is it possible for a creature to love the Creator for who he is, regardless of what he gives or takes away? God's honor and the validity of his relationship with humanity are on the line, and the life of an unsuspecting man in the land of Uz has been chosen as the proving ground for this eternal truth. God's response is one of the most surprising and revealing in all of Scripture. He does not enter into a theological debate with the accuser. Instead, with a sovereign and unshakable confidence in his servant, he grants permission for the test. Very well then, everything he has is in your power. But on the man himself, do not lay a finger. God sets the limits, demonstrating that he remains in absolute control, but he allows the storm to form. He is so certain of the authenticity of the faith he himself nurtured in Job that he does not fear subjecting it to the most intense fire. God knows that true gold is not consumed by the furnace, but purified by it, shining with even greater intensity. Thus, the stage of the conflict is transferred from heaven to earth. Job, knowing nothing of the celestial debate, becomes the unwitting protagonist of a test of epic proportions. He is not a random piece in a cosmic game, but the chosen representative of faithful humanity. His response under pressure will not only determine his own fate, but will serve as a resounding answer to Satan's accusation, an answer that will echo through the corridors of time. The integrity of a single human heart has been elevated to a standard of universal importance. The entire universe, angels and demons, holds its breath to see if one man's faith can bear the weight of hell unleashed against him. What follows is not, therefore, a series of tragic and random events. It is a carefully calibrated test, a systematic deconstruction of every pillar of security and joy in Job's life. The accuser is given permission to remove the blessings, to test his theory that Job's faith was only skin deep, a thin layer of gratitude over a core of selfishness. The heavenly curtain closes, and the spotlight turns to the solitary figure of Job, who is about to be struck by a succession of calamities so swift and devastating that they would seem to be the very fury of God unleashed against him. The cosmic conflict over the nature of faith will now become an existential struggle for the survival of one man's soul. So that we may grasp the magnitude of this trial, the Word of God invites us to know the man at the center of the storm. The book of Job begins with a formal introduction, almost a divine character reference. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Job 1:1. These are not trivial qualities. They represent the four pillars of wisdom and piety in the ancient world. Blameless speaks to his wholeness of heart, upright to his just conduct toward others, fearing God to his vertical reverence, and turning away from evil to his moral separation. Job was not a perfect man, but he was the closest to moral perfection that humanity could present, a living example of God's covenant with man. Attesting to this description, the creator of the universe himself becomes Job's chief defense witness in the celestial court. Before the accuser, God declares with holy satisfaction, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Job 1:8. Let us consider the weight of this declaration. The God who searches hearts and knows every hidden intention, who sees beyond all appearances, presents Job as his standard of excellence on earth. This divine validation is crucial, for it removes from the outset any suspicion that Job's suffering was a punishment for a hidden sin. The tragedy that will follow is not about a sinner being punished, but about a righteous man being tested. It is then that the cosmic accusation is formally launched, poisoning the atmosphere of the throne room with its skepticism. Satan responds to God's praise with a cutting question. Does Job fear God for nothing? Job 1:9. With this single sentence, he disqualifies all of Job's piety, labeling it as self-serving. The accuser argues that Job's faith is a mere business transaction. He worships God because God blesses him. Job's loyalty, according to Satan, is not an act of love, but an insurance policy. He challenges God, asserting that if the hedge of protection of material and familial blessings were removed, Job's true face a face of bitterness and rebellion, would be revealed for all of heaven to see. Confident in the incorruptible seed he himself planted in his servant's heart, God accepts the challenge, but establishes clear and sovereign limits. Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. Job 1:12. God hands over Job's possessions, but not his life, to the power of the accuser. This divine permission is not an act of weakness or indifference, but of supreme confidence. God is allowing Job's faith to be subjected to unimaginable pressure, knowing that its authenticity, forged in a genuine relationship, will not only survive, but shine with even greater glory. The battle for Job's soul and for God's honor was about to begin on the battlefield of his own life. The storm erupts over Job with terrifying speed and fury. In a single day, 4 messengers arrive, each bearing news of a calamity that has wiped out a portion of his vast fortune and his servants. First, his oxen and donkeys are taken. Then, his sheep are consumed by a fire of God. Next, his camels are stolen. Each blow is more devastating than the last, systematically dismantling the empire he had built. Yet, these were merely preliminary tremors, preparing the ground for the earthquake that would shake the foundations of his existence. The accuser was just beginning to test the depths of the righteous man's devotion. The final and most crushing blow comes with the last messenger. His face pale and his voice trembling, he reports that while his 7 sons and 3 daughters were feasting, a great wind from the desert struck the house, which collapsed on them, killing them all. In an instant, Job's future, his lineage, the joy of his house, everything was erased. Here, the pain transcends the material and becomes an open wound in the soul. The silence that followed that news must have been heavier than the earth itself. The accuser had torn away not just the blessings, but the very heart of Job's world, waiting to hear the sound of a curse rise from the ruins. Job's response, however, shocked the visible and invisible realms. He stood up, tore his robe in a sign of mourning, shaved his head in a sign of deep anguish, and then did the unthinkable. He fell to the ground in worship. From his lips came not a curse, but one of the most profound declarations of faith ever uttered. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Job 1:21. With these words, Job acknowledged God's absolute sovereignty over all things, affirming that his right to worship did not depend on what he possessed, but on who God was. The accuser's first assault resulted in a resounding defeat, but the test was not yet over. In a second heavenly hearing, Satan argues that Job endured the loss of his possessions and children, but he would not endure pain in his own body. Skin for skin, a man will give all he has for his own life. Job 2:4. Again, God grants permission with a new limit. Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. Job 2-6. Immediately Job is afflicted with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. His physical agony was so intense that he sat among the ashes, scraping his sores with a piece of broken pottery. It was at this point of abject misery that his own wife urged him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." But Job remained firm, rebuking her. "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" It is in this scene of desolation that 3 of Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, arrive to comfort him. Seeing him from a distance, they barely recognize him, so great was his disfigurement. In an act of genuine initial compassion, they sit with him in silence for 7 days and 7 nights, for they saw that his suffering was very great. This silence, however, was the calm before a new storm, a storm of words. When Job finally breaks the silence by cursing the day he was born, his friends begin to speak, and their comfort turns into a theological accusation that would only deepen the wounds of his soul. The central argument of the three friends rests on a rigid and inflexible doctrine known as retribution theology. In their worldview, the universe operates under a simple and direct moral system of cause and effect. God is just, therefore he always blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked. For them, the math was clear. If Job was suffering so extraordinarily, the only logical conclusion was that he had committed a secret sin of equally extraordinary proportions. They came to comfort a friend, but ended up becoming prosecutors, pressuring Job to confess a transgression he insisted he had not committed. Eliphaz, the eldest, bases his argument on a supposed spiritual revelation, a night vision that taught him that no mortal can be more righteous than God. He gently suggests that Job must have sinned to deserve such punishment. Bildad, the traditionalist, appeals to the wisdom of the ancestors, arguing that history proves the wicked are always uprooted from their prosperity. Zophar, the most dogmatic and severe, accuses Job directly of wickedness, claiming that his suffering is actually less than his sins deserve. Their speeches, though well-intentioned, became hammers striking an already broken man. Have you ever received advice that hurt more than it helped? Share your experience in the comments. Over dozens of chapters, we witness Job fervently defending himself against these accusations. He never claims to be sinless, but he defends his fundamental integrity with tooth and nail. He knows, in his heart of hearts, that he has committed no heinous crime that could justify the annihilation of his life. His struggle is not just against physical pain, but also against the suffocating theology of his friends. They try to frame God in a predictable doctrinal box, while Job longs for an encounter with the real God, the God who seems to have become his enemy, a God he can no longer understand, but whom he desperately seeks to present his case. Job's desperation leads him to cry out for a mediator, an umpire who could stand between him and God. He longs for his day in court, so he can argue his innocence before the judge of all the earth. In the midst of his agony, he utters words of a faith that transcends logic and the hope of life itself, as in Job 13:15. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. This is a faith not based on favorable circumstances, nor even on the preservation of one's own life, but one that clings to the character of God even when his actions are incomprehensible and painful. Job's faith is being purified in the furnace, separating the gold from the dross of a simplistic theology. After the long and exhausting cycles of debates with his friends and a speech from a young man named Elihu, the climax of the story approaches. When all human argument is exhausted and silence finally falls, God intervenes. But his answer does not come in a gentle, comforting voice. It erupts from the overwhelming force of a whirlwind. Nature itself bows as the Creator finally speaks directly to Job. The expectation is that God will finally explain why, that he will reveal the celestial wager and justify his actions. However, God does none of this. He offers Job not an explanation, but a revelation. From chapters 38 to 41, God subjects Job to a divine cross-examination, a series of more than 70 rhetorical questions that expose the vast gap between the Creator's wisdom and the creature's understanding. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Job 38:4. God takes Job on a cosmic tour of creation, questioning him about the laws that govern the oceans, the stars, the clouds, and the wildest and most untamable animals, like the behemoth and the leviathan. He is not humiliating Job for pleasure, but radically recalibrating his perspective. The purpose of this overwhelming discourse was not to diminish Job's pain, but to enlarge his vision of God. If Job could not comprehend the mysteries of the natural world he could see, how could he expect to comprehend the sovereign designs and moral purposes of the God who governs the invisible universe? God was not saying that Job's suffering didn't matter, but that the reason behind it was woven into a tapestry of wisdom and power so vast and complex that the human mind simply could not grasp it. The answer to Job's pain was not a logical reason, but the majesty of the person who was in control of everything. Job's response to this theophany is one of complete surrender and worship. He does not receive an explanation for his suffering, but he receives something infinitely greater, a clear vision of who God is. He responds with humility and reverence. "I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted." Job 42:2. He acknowledges that he spoke of things he did not understand, things too wonderful for him. The pain and confusion led him to question, but the encounter with God's presence led him to silence and worship, showing that intimacy with the Creator surpasses the need for explanations. Then Job utters the phrase that summarizes his entire transformative journey. "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." Job 42:5. Before the trial, his knowledge of God was theoretical, based on tradition and doctrine, a knowledge by hearing. It was correct, but distant. The furnace of suffering, however, burned away this second-hand faith and forced him into a personal, direct, and undeniable encounter with the living God. He didn't find the answers he was looking for, but he found the person who was the answer itself. The pain stripped him of everything so that he could finally see God without distractions. This revelation is the true climax of the story, the restoration of his possessions and family. Which happens next is merely a consequence, a footnote in the story of his spiritual transformation. Job learned that the greatest blessing is not the absence of suffering, but the presence of God in the midst of it. He entered the trial as a righteous man who knew the rules, and he came out of it as a humble worshipper who knew the King. The suffering did not destroy him. It deepened him, leading him from a faith in a system to a faith in a person. The biblical exposition of Job's story teaches us a disconcerting and liberating truth. God does not owe us explanations. He owes us himself. He does not promise to deliver us from every furnace, but he promises to be with us in each one. Job's journey, from the integrity attested by God to worship amidst the ashes, through the debate with his friends and culminating in the encounter with God in the whirlwind, serves as a map for all of us. It shows us that the strongest faith is not one that never in questions, but one that continues to seek God's face even when his hand seems inexplicably heavy. Thus, the biblical drama is complete. Satan's challenge was answered. Job's faith proved to be not transactional, but relational. He did not curse God, he saw him more clearly. Job's friends, with their rigid theology, were rebuked by God himself for not speaking what was right. And Job, the suffering servant, was vindicated, not by his own righteousness, but by his perseverance in seeking the God, who was, all along, weaving a purpose far greater than his pain. His story becomes an eternal monument to the sovereignty of God and the resilience of a faith that flourishes not in the absence of storms, but at their epicenter. The drama of Job transcends the narrative of a personal tragedy. It unfolds as an epic conflict in three simultaneous arenas, each with its own protagonists and with stakes of eternal consequence. The central tension is not merely that of a man battling his suffering, but the monumental collision between human faith in its purest and most desperate form and the cold, calculating logic of retribution. On earth, a man debates his accusers. In heaven, the nature of worship is put on trial, and within Job's soul, a war is waged between hope and despair. These three threads of conflict, the cosmic, the theological, and the existential, intertwine to form a tapestry of spiritual tension that forces us to question everything we think we know about God, justice, and suffering. The first and grandest battlefield is the cosmic one. This is not a conflict of swords and shields, but of ideologies that govern the universe. On one side, we have God's perspective, who glories in a creation capable of loving him freely for who he is, not for what he gives. On the other is the philosophy of the accuser, a universal cynicism that posits all virtue is a mask for selfishness and that faith is merely the price paid for prosperity. Job's life becomes the test case, the crucial experiment to validate one of these two worldviews. The heavenly wager is not a divine game, but the dramatization of a fundamental question. Can genuine worship exist in a universe where pain and loss are palpable realities? In this cosmic courtroom, God takes on the role of the confident defender, while Satan acts as the relentless prosecutor. The accuser does not question God's power, but his wisdom and character. He essentially accuses God of bribing humanity for loyalty, creating a system of blessings that masks the true mercenary nature of his worshippers. Every calamity that befalls Job is one of Satan's arguments being tested in practice. He removes wealth, family, and health, believing that by stripping Job of all the benefits of his faith, he will inevitably expose the rotten core of self-interest that, in his view, resides in the heart of every creature. The conflict is an attempt to unmask the very glory of God. Meanwhile, Job, the earthly protagonist, remains in an agony of ignorance. He has no knowledge of the heavenly assembly, the accusation, or the divine permission. He is God's champion, but fights without knowing the cause. This ignorance is the source of excruciating dramatic tension. Each of his laments, his questions, and his stubborn declarations of innocence echoes in the celestial arena with a significance he himself cannot comprehend. His solitary struggle in the ashes is, in fact, a battle fought before an audience of angelic beings. The cosmic conflict depends entirely on the response of a man who does not know he is being watched, making his perseverance an act of pure, unperformed faith. The tension in this invisible arena is palpable. The universe holds its breath. If Job gives in, if he curses God as the accuser predicted, then Satan's cynical philosophy will be validated. The relationship between creator and creature would be exposed as a transactional farce, and God's honor would be stained by the accusation that his rule is maintained not by love, but by self-interest. But if Job perseveres, if his faith survives the furnace, then the accusation will be silenced forever. His integrity will become an eternal testimony that faith can be relational, not just transactional, and that love for God can flourish even in the most barren soil of suffering. The soul of one man becomes the mirror that reflects the truth about the heart of the universe. Descending from the celestial arena to the dust of the land of Uz, the conflict transforms into an intense theological debate. The arrival of Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, marks the beginning of the second battlefront. Here, the fight is not against a spiritual adversary, but against a rigid and inhuman belief system. The conflict is not about whether God exists, but about how he governs the world. On one side is the theology of retribution, championed by the Friends, which insists on a morally ordered universe where suffering is always and only the direct consequence of sin. On the other is the lived experience of Job, a righteous man who suffers, whose very existence shatters this simplistic theological formula. Job's friends represent the human attempt to box God into limited and predictable doctrines. Their theology is a neat, organized map that gives them a sense of security and control. On this map, every road of sin leads directly to a cliff of punishment, and every path of righteousness leads to a garden of blessings. Job's inexplicable suffering is a terrifying anomaly on their map, a reality they cannot accept. Therefore, instead of questioning the map, they try to force Job to fit into it. insisting that he must have strayed onto a secret road of sin. Their conflict is with ambiguity, with mystery, with a God who does not conform to their systematic expectations. Job, in turn, becomes the champion of a more complex and painful reality. He fights not against God, but against the caricature of God his friends present to him. His fervent defense of his innocence is not an act of pride, but a refusal to lie about his life to make his friends' theology work. He represents the voice of honest experience against cold dogma. The theological conflict is a clash between a closed system, which sacrifices people to preserve ideas, and an open faith, which is willing to wrestle with God and live in tension to preserve the truth. Job yearns for an encounter with the real God, not the predictable idol his friends have constructed with their logic. The tension in this debate grows with each cycle of speeches. What begins as an attempt at comfort quickly deteriorates into a brutal interrogation session. The friends, frustrated by Job's refusal to confess, become increasingly cruel in their accusations. They turn theology into a weapon, using it to beat a man who is already down. In response, Job's cries become more anguished, and his questions to God more audacious. The tragedy is that both sides believe they are defending God, yet the chasm between them widens, demonstrating how religion without compassion can become a destructive force, inflicting wounds deeper than the calamity itself. This theological confrontation exposes one of the most fundamental struggles of human spirituality, our desire to domesticate the divine. Job's friends personify the tendency to reduce the infinite God to a set of manageable principles, to turn mystery into math. Job, in his agony, is forced to abandon this security. He is pushed to the edge of the abyss of faith, where the old formulas no longer work, and the only thing left is the honest cry of a naked soul before a silent and incomprehensible God. The conflict reveals that true faith is not about having all the answers, but about learning to live with the questions, trusting in the person of God when his plans are an absolute mystery. Finally, the battlefield narrows to the most intimate and intense arena, the existential conflict within Job's own soul. Here, there are no more external accusers, only the civil war between what he has always believed and what he now feels. It is the struggle of a man to maintain his integrity, his core identity, while the universe seems to conspire to prove that his entire life has been a lie. The tension comes not from an external threat, but from the possibility of an internal collapse, the implosion of his faith under the unbearable weight of his pain and God's apparent betrayal. In this inner war, Job's faith is in direct conflict with his experience. His faith tells him that God is just, good, and sovereign. His experience, however, screams that God has become his tormentor, a relentless hunter targeting him with poisoned arrows for no reason. He struggles with the cognitive dissonance of trying to reconcile the God he knew with the God he now encountered. This is the heart of his lament, not just the pain of the sores, but the agony of a relationship that seems to have been broken, the pain of feeling abandoned and pursued by the one in whom he had placed all his trust. The central temptation in this existential struggle is to succumb to his wife's advice: curse God and die. This is not just a suggestion to end his physical suffering. It is an invitation to commit spiritual suicide. Cursing God would be the final act of capitulation, the admission that the accuser was right all along, that his faith was in fact conditional. It would mean abandoning his integrity, the only thing he had left. Job's battle, at every moment of his agony, was a conscious choice to refuse to take that step, to hold on to a spark of trust amidst an ocean of contrary evidence. Job's internal conflict is so profound that he feels crushed by the distance between himself, a frail and mortal creature, and God, the infinite power that seems to have crushed him. It is from this unbearable tension that one of his deepest longings is born, a cry for a mediator, an arbitrator who could lay a hand on them both and present his case. His pain forces him to realize his own inability to justify himself before God and to desire an intercessor. The existential conflict, at its darkest point, paradoxically gives birth to a seed of redemptive hope, a glimpse of a solution he himself could not fully comprehend. Job's struggle not to curse God is, in essence, a struggle to hold on to his own identity as a worshipper of the true God, even if it means worshiping a God he no longer understands. His integrity is not the absence of doubt, anger, or questioning. He expresses all of these in abundance. His integrity is his stubborn refusal to sever the relationship. He would rather argue with God than give up on God. It is this relational tenacity, this wounded but persistent faith, that constitutes his true victory on the existential battlefield and the final defeat of the accuser's premise. Thus, the three conflicts converge on the solitary figure of Job. He stands at the center of a cosmic wager he knows nothing about, in the middle of a theological debate that distorts his pain, and in an existential war that threatens to consume his soul. Every word he utters, every tear he sheds, reverberates through these three dimensions. The tension is held at an almost unbearable level because the resolution of one conflict depends on the resolution of the others. The drama of Job shows us that faith is not lived in a quiet vacuum, but at the nexus of invisible battles, intellectual debates and internal struggles that test the very foundation of our devotion. After all human wisdom has been exhausted, a deep and heavy silence falls over the land of Uz. Job's friends, with their broken theologies, have fallen silent. The young Elihu, with his impetuous anger, has run out of words. And Job, the suffering servant, exhausted by pain and struggle, waits at the center of his own ruins. The human courtroom is adjourned, and all arguments have proven futile, like dust in the wind. It is in this vacuum of answers, this bankruptcy of logic and rhetoric, that the stage is finally set for the only protagonist whose voice truly matters. Humanity tried to explain suffering, to judge it, and to understand it, and failed. Now, suffering itself and the sufferer will be confronted not by an idea, but by the author of existence itself. Then, the climax erupts, not with a messenger angel or a subtle vision, but with a manifestation of raw, uncontrollable power that shakes the very foundations of creation. The sky darkens, the air grows thick and electric, and from the horizon rises a whirlwind, a spinning column of dust and power connecting heaven and earth. This is no ordinary storm. It is the chariot of God, a pulpit woven from wind and majesty. Nature itself writhes in the presence of its master, announcing that the King of the universe has arrived to speak. The sound is not of a gentle whisper, but of a force that could uproot mountains, a voice that rides upon the storm and silences the entire cosmos, directed at a single man sitting in ashes. From the storm, the voice of God thunders, but not with the words of comfort Job might have expected. Instead, he issues a direct and piercing challenge. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Job 38:2-3. The entire universe is inverted in that moment. Job, who for 37 chapters cried out for an audience to question God, now finds himself on the witness stand. The judge of all the earth assumes the role of interrogator. Job's premise that he could stand on equal footing with God and demand an explanation is dismantled before the first question is even fully formed. Man is not there to audit God, but to be confronted by the reality of who he is. Then begins not an explanation, but a revelation. God does not address the heavenly wager, Job's suffering, or Satan's accusations. Instead, he takes Job, on a dizzying tour of the vastness of his own creation, beginning at the dawn of time. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? Job 38, 4-5. We are transported to the dawn of time, to the moment when God, like a master architect, designed the cosmos. The implicit question is crushing. Job, if you were not even present to witness the beginning, how can you presume to judge the middle of my story? The journey continues, exposing God's sovereign control over the most chaotic and untamable forces of nature. He questions Job about the raging sea, asking who shut it behind doors when it burst forth from the womb, setting a limit and saying, "This far you may come and no farther." Job 38:11. He interrogates him about the storehouses of the snow and the reserves of the hail, about the path where light is dispersed, and about the channels that guide the lightning, and the torrential rains. Each question reveals that the phenomena humanity fears and barely understands are, to God, docile instruments in his hands. He does not react to the chaos of the universe. He orchestrates it with unquestionable authority, weaving order from what appears to us as disorder. The perspective then shifts to the animal kingdom, and God reveals his intimate care and purpose for creatures that live far beyond the sphere of human influence. He asks Job if he can hunt the prey for the lioness or satisfy the appetites of her cubs. He confronts him with the freedom of the wild donkey, which scoffs at the tumult of the city, and with the majesty of the hawk that flies south by divine command. The argument is subtle but profound. If God's wisdom and providence extend so complexly to corners of creation that have no apparent relation to humanity, does it not suggest that his purposes are infinitely more vast and multifaceted than the small lens of Job's human justice can perceive? Herein lies the central revelation, the true turning point of the climax. God never answers the question, "Why me?" Instead, he answers with the question, "Who am I?" He does not offer Job a map to understand the labyrinth of his suffering. Instead, he reveals himself as the architect of the labyrinth, a mind so vast and a power so absolute that the very need for a map becomes obsolete. The solution to Job's pain is found not in a logical explanation, but in a personal revelation. A pain is not explained. It is eclipsed by the overwhelming greatness of the God who allowed it. The focus is violently torn from the problem of pain and fixed on the person of the sovereign God. To seal this point with unforgettable force, God introduces two of his most formidable and mysterious creatures, the behemoth and the Leviathan. He describes the behemoth, perhaps a hippopotamus or a mythical creature, as the masterpiece of his creation, a force of unmatched power. He then describes the Leviathan, a fire-breathing sea monster, so terrifying that no one dares to disturb it. These creatures symbolize the forces of nature and evil that are completely untamable by man. They represent the aspects of the world that are dangerous, chaotic, and operate outside of human control. They are, in essence, the problem of evil in creature form. God's argument reaches its apex with irrefutable logic. He asks Job if he can catch the Leviathan with a hook or put a rope through its nose. The answer is an obvious and resounding no. The conclusion, therefore, is devastating to Job's case. If you dare not rouse my creature, then who are you to stand against me, its creator? Paraphrase of Job 41:10. If the human mind cannot even comprehend or master a fraction of the chaotic power that exists in creation, how could it arrogantly demand that the creator of all explain and justify himself